Once upon a time, in the town of Bafo, there lived a very, very gorgeous and endowed woman. Nobody knew where she came from. Nobody knew her mother. Nobody knew her father. She had no family, no past, no story. But the moment men set eyes on her, they forgot to ask questions. Her name was Kemi, and Kemi was beautiful. Her skin glowed like the morning sun. Her eyes sparkled like the stars. When she walked, it was like the wind carried her, smooth, silent, magical. But it was not just her beauty that made men stop and stare. It was the waist bead around her hips. The bead jingled softly as she walked. A sound so sweet, so tempting, it made men's hearts beat faster. They didn't know why, but something about that bead made them feel things they couldn't explain. The men of Bafo whispered about her. "Who is she?" they asked. "Where did she come from?" But no one had an answer. The only thing they knew was this: Kemi did not belong to anyone. She was not married. She had no family. She had no friends. She simply walked through the market every day, her waist bead singing its quiet song, her body swaying like a gentle river. And the men? They wanted her. They followed her with their eyes. They fought among themselves to get her attention. They spent their money just to impress her. And Kemi noticed. She smiled at them. She let them talk to her. She let them take her out, spend their riches on her. But she had one rule. Whenever they want to have something together, she never lets them touch her waist bead, not to talk of taking it off. She always insists that they do it with her waist bead on. "Why?" they asked. Kemi would smile, her fingers brushing their cheeks. "Because it makes me sweeter," she whispered. And the men, they believed her. They didn't ask questions. They didn't think twice. Because once a man got close to Kemi, his mind no longer worked the way it should. And that was their mistake. They followed blindly, not knowing that they were walking straight into their own destruction. Tali was the first man that walked right into her trap. Tali was the richest trader in Bafo. He owned the biggest shops. His warehouses were filled with gold, spices, and fine fabrics from faraway lands. When he walked through the market, people stepped aside. When he spoke, men listened. When he spent money, it flowed like a river. But the day he saw Kemi, all his riches meant nothing. She walked past his shop, her waist bead jingling softly. Tali's eyes followed her. His heart pounded. His hands trembled. He had never seen a woman so beautiful, never in his life. "I must have her," he whispered. That night, he sent gifts to her house: gold, fine clothes, perfumes that smelled like heaven. But Kemi sent them back. The next day, he sent more, and the next, and the next. Still, Kemi refused. Tali could not sleep. He could not eat. His mind was filled with her smile, her voice, the way her waist bead moved when she walked. So he went to her himself. "Kemi," he said, standing before her, "I will give you anything. Just be mine." Kemi tilted her head, her lips curling into a small smile. "Anything?" she asked. "Anything," Tali promised. Kemi took his hand, her fingers soft like silk. "Then take me home." Tali's heart raced. His hands shook. He led her to his mansion, a house bigger than any in Bafo. That night, they lay together, the moonlight shining through the windows. Tali reached for her waist bead, his fingers brushing against it. The beads were cool, smooth, and they gave off a strange energy he could not explain. "Take it off," he whispered. Kemi smiled, her eyes shining in the dim light. "No," she said softly. "It makes me sweeter and more fun to handle." Tali, lost in desire, did not question her. He pulled her closer and they got intimate, blinded by the fire in his heart. And that was the last night he would ever sleep in that house. The next morning, disaster struck. Tali's biggest warehouse caught fire. The flames roared like an angry beast, swallowing everything: his gold, his fabrics, his spices. The smoke curled into the sky, black and thick, as if the heavens were mourning his loss. People ran, water was thrown, but nothing could save it. By evening, his empire was gone. Tali stood in front of the ashes, his mouth open, his mind blank. "How?" he cried, but the misfortune did not stop. That night, a terrible storm came. The wind howled like a spirit seeking revenge. Lightning flashed. The rain poured. And before morning, Tali's grand mansion, the same house where he had held Kemi, collapsed under the weight of the storm. By the next day, he had nothing left. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, his wife packed her things and left, taking their children with her. "Everything I built, gone," Tali whispered, his voice hollow. 2 weeks later, the great Tali, the richest trader in Bafo, was seen sitting in the marketplace with dust on his clothes, his hands outstretched, begging for food. People passed him, shaking their heads. "How did this happen?" they whispered. Tali himself did not know, but Kemi knew. She walked through the market, her waist bead jingling softly, and more men looked at her. More men wanted her. And just like Tali, they had no idea what was coming. Next was King Okoli, the ruler of Bafo town. His name was feared, his voice was law. He had wives, many wives. He had servants who ran at his command. His warriors were strong, his enemies trembled before him. He had everything until he saw Kemi. That day, he sat on his golden throne, watching the dancers perform in the palace courtyard. Then she walked in, Kemi. The air changed, the drums slowed. The king's eyes locked on her, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. "Who is she?" he asked. "She is Kemi, my king," a servant replied. "She has no family, no history, but every man in Bafo desires her." King Okoli stroked his beard. "Then I must have her." And as a king, he always got what he wanted. That evening, his messengers went to Kemi. They carried gifts, gold, fine silks, jewels from distant lands. But Kemi did not even look at them. "Tell the king," she said, her voice like honey, "if he wants me, he must come himself." No woman had ever spoken such words to the king. But instead of anger, King Okoli felt something else. He felt hunger. That night, the palace doors opened and the king himself walked into Kemi's small home. The richest, most powerful man in Bafo stood before the woman with no past. "Kemi," he said, "come to my palace." Kemi smiled. "Only if you ask me with your heart, not your power." The king had never begged before, but for Kemi, he did. And so she followed him to the palace. That night, under the golden roof of the king's chambers, Kemi lay beside the king. The fire burned low, casting shadows on the walls. King Okoli reached for her waist, his fingers brushing against the cool beads. "Take it off," he said. Kemi's lips curled into a smile. "No," she whispered. "It makes everything sweeter. The sound, the feel, it makes the moment unforgettable." The king, lost in his own desire, did not argue. He did not question. He only pulled her close, his mind full of nothing but her. Then he slept with her that night. And that was his downfall. 7 days passed. On the 8th day, the palace changed. The king's chiefs, his closest men, turned against him. They gathered in secret, whispering, The king has lost his power, they said. The gods have abandoned him, they murmured. The palace guards, once loyal, now looked at him with strange eyes. His servants moved with less respect. Even his wives avoided him. Then the disasters began. One by one, his best warriors fell sick. His cattle died overnight. His treasures, gold, ivory, rare gems, vanished as if the earth swallowed them. The people of Bafo grew restless. The market women hissed his name under their breath. The elders shook their heads. He is no longer fit to rule, they said. And on the seventh night, the people gathered at the palace gates, torches burning in their hands. King Okoli must go, they shouted. The king, once mighty, now stood alone. His chiefs had betrayed him. His warriors had lost faith. His people had turned against him. And so, with nothing but the clothes on his back, the great King Okoli fled into the forest, his crown left behind in the dust. And Kemi? She walked through the market the next morning, her waist bead jingling softly. She smiled. Another man had fallen, and there was still more to come. Then came Benji. Benji was a man blessed by the gods. He was young, smart, and richer than men twice his age. While others struggled to count their coins, Benji counted stacks of money in his bank office. He had a beautiful wife, the kind that turned heads when she walked. His children were bright and full of laughter. His house was big, with marble floors and servants who bowed when he entered. Everything was perfect, until he saw Kemi. That day, Benji was in the marketplace, his mind on business. Then, a soft jingling sound touched his ears. He turned, and there she was, Kemi. Her waist bead glowed under the afternoon sun, her skin smooth like fresh palm oil, her eyes deep and dark like the river at night. Benji forgot everything, his wife, his children, his business. He only saw her. He followed her, his heart racing. Kemi, he said, blocking her path, I must have you. Kemi smiled. Must? She asked, tilting her head. Benji swallowed hard. Please, he whispered. I will do anything. Kemi looked at him for a long moment. Then she touched his hand. Then come, she said. That night, Benji lay beside her, his fingers trailing over her soft skin. He reached for her waist, feeling the smooth beads under his palm. Why don't you take it off? He asked. Kemi smiled, her voice as sweet as ripe mango. No, she whispered. It makes me sweeter. Benji did not argue. He was too lost in her to care. The next morning, he woke up feeling like a king. He kissed Kemi's lips, dressed quickly, and rushed to his bank. His heart was light. His mind was full of dreams. But the moment he stepped into his office, everything changed. His boss stood waiting, his face dark like a storm. Benji, he said coldly, where is the missing money? Benji frowned. What money? The millions you stole, his boss roared. The accounts show it was you. Benji's stomach twisted. I didn't steal anything, he protested. His boss slammed his hand on the desk. Get out, he barked. You are fired, and I hope the Lord deals with you. Before Benji could speak, 2 guards grabbed his arms and dragged him out of the bank. People watched, whispering, Benji, the banker, a thief? Benji's head spun. His heart pounded. How? By the time he reached home, his troubles had only begun. His wife stood by the door, a letter in her hand. A letter that told her everything. The missing money, the accusations, the shame. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. Benji, she whispered, tell me it's not true. Benji reached for her, but she stepped back. I don't know who you are anymore, she said, her voice breaking. I cannot raise my children with a thief. She picked up her bags. She called the children. She left. Just like that. Benji stood in his empty house, his mind blank, his heart shattered. 1 week ago, he had everything. Now, he had nothing, and he never understood why. But Kemi knew. She walked through the marketplace, her waist bead jingling softly, and another man watched her, his eyes hungry. And Kemi smiled. It was his turn next. Bafo was no longer the town it used to be. The men were falling, one by one. Some lost their wealth overnight, their riches vanishing like smoke in the wind. Some lost their families, watching helplessly as their wives packed their things and left without looking back. Some went mad, running through the streets with wild eyes, speaking to the air, laughing at things no one else could see. And at the center of it all was Kemi. Her waist beads still jingled as she walked through the marketplace. Her smile was still sweet, her beauty still untouched. But behind her smile, there was something else. Power. 17 men had been with her. 17 men had fallen. The people of Bafo whispered in fear. It is bad luck, they said. It is the gods, others murmured. But no one knew the truth. The women of Bafo, seeing how men worshipped Kemi, started wearing waist beads too. They walked through the market, their beads clinking softly, hoping to turn heads like she did, hoping to hold the same power over men. But nothing changed. Their beads were just beads. Their beauty was just beauty. Only Kemi's waist bead carried the secret. Only Kemi had the power to take, to drain, to destroy. And still, the men of Bafo did not learn. They saw what happened to others, but they told themselves, it will not happen to me. They watched Tali go from the richest man to a beggar, yet they did not turn away. They saw King Okoli, the mighty king, chased into the forest with nothing but rags on his back, yet they still desired her. They saw Benji lose everything in 1 week, yet they still chased after her, smiling, begging, willing to risk it all. Because when Kemi walked past, when her waist bead jingled, when she looked at a man and smiled, his fate was sealed, and still she was not done. Because the next man she would meet would change everything, and the next was Boma. Boma was not like the others. He was a man without shame, without guilt, without fear. He had married 15 wives, and all 15 had left him. Why? Because they caught him with other women, and Boma did not care. If one wife left, another took her place. If one cried, he laughed. If one begged, he turned his back. Women were nothing to him. And when he saw Kemi, he did not chase her like the others. He did not send gifts. He did not waste his money. He watched her. He studied her. He waited. Then, when he was ready, he walked up to her in the market, his voice deep and steady. I want you, he said. Kemi smiled, tilting her head like she always did. Then have me, she said, running her fingers along his arm. Boma smirked. He had won, or so he thought. That night, in his house, Kemi lay beside him, her soft skin glowing under the candlelight. Boma ran his hands over her body. He was a man who had been with many women, but none like her. There was something different, something powerful. Then he felt it. The waist bead, smooth, cold, strange. He frowned. His fingers traced over it again. Take it off, he ordered. Kemi's lips curled into a knowing smile. No, she whispered, her voice as sweet as honey. It makes me sweeter. Boma pulled back. He was not like the others. He was not blinded by desire. He was not a fool. His eyes narrowed. "No," he said firmly. "Take it off." Kemi blinked. The smile on her face faltered just a little. She had never met a man who questioned her waist speed. Never. Still, she tried again. She leaned in close, her breath warm against his skin. "You will enjoy it more with it on," she whispered. But Boma did not move. His face was stone. His eyes were sharp. "I don't want you if you cannot take it off," he said, his voice cold. Kemi's heart skipped. Nobody had ever refused her before. Nobody. She sat up, her long hair falling over her shoulders, her fingers tightening slightly on the beads. Boma did not beg. He did not plead. He did not try again. He simply leaned back and crossed his arms. "Then go," he said. Kemi's eyes darkened. For the first time, she felt something she had never felt before. Fear. Kemi rose from the bed, her face calm, but inside, her heart was beating fast. She had never been in this situation before. No man had ever told her to leave. No man had ever questioned her waist bead. She reached for her dress. "Maybe next time," she said, forcing a smile. But Boma was watching her closely. His sharp eyes missed nothing. "There is no next time," he said, his voice low. Kemi turned to walk away, but before she could take a step, Boma moved, faster than she expected, stronger than she imagined. His hands grabbed her wrist. His other hand reached for the waist bead. Kemi gasped. "Stop!" she shouted, twisting in his grip. But Boma was a man who did not listen, a man who did not care. With all his strength, he yanked the waist bead. Snap! The beads broke apart. A terrible scream tore through the night. Kemi's body jerked. Her eyes widened in horror. She clutched her stomach, her fingers digging into her skin. Something was happening. Something was wrong. Her breath came out in short, sharp gasps. Her legs shook. Her skin felt like fire, like something inside her was burning, twisting, breaking. Then she ran. Out of the house, out of the streets. She ran naked, her screams waking the whole town. Doors flew open. Men, women, children. Everyone rushed outside, their eyes wide with shock. "Kemi?" someone gasped. They had never seen her like this. Never seen her afraid. Never seen her weak. She ran past them, her hair wild, her body shaking, her hands clawing at her skin. "She's mad!" a woman shouted. "Something has happened," another cried. Boma stood in his doorway, watching. He held the broken beads in his hand, his fingers curled around them. His face was calm, but his mind was turning. He had broken something, something important, and whatever power Kemi had before, it was gone. Kemi ran through the streets, her feet bare, her body shaking. Her screams echoed through the town, waking every soul in Bafo. People rushed after her, their eyes wide with shock. "Kemi," a woman called, "cover yourself." Another woman grabbed a wrapper, trying to wrap it around her nakedness. But Kemi slapped it away. Her body twisted. Her hands pulled at her hair. Her mouth opened wide, but the words that came out were not her own. It was as if something inside her had been waiting to speak. And now, the truth spilled out. "I was nothing," Kemi wailed, her voice raw. "I was a poor girl, a hungry girl. No father, no mother, no food, no home." The crowd gasped. They had never heard her speak of her past before. Kemi fell to her knees, gripping the dirt in her fingers. "I went to my grandmother," she sobbed. "A woman of the spirits. A woman feared by all. A witch." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people stepped back. Others clutched their charms and whispered prayers. Kemi's body shook as she continued. I told her I wanted riches. I told her I wanted power. She laughed, a wild, broken laugh. And she gave me this. Her trembling hands pointed to the broken waist bead on the ground. The waist bead, she whispered. It was not ordinary. It carried power. It carried hunger. The people listened, their faces frozen with fear. My grandmother told me, Kemi continued, her voice cracking, that for every man who lay with me, I would take his fortune, his blessings, his strength. Tears streamed down her face. 21 men, she sobbed. I needed 21 men. Then my power would be complete. Then I would be the richest woman in the world. She lifted her head, her eyes filled with madness. But Boma, her voice trembled. Boma was supposed to be the last. He was number 21. She gripped her stomach, her fingers pressing into her skin as if trying to hold something inside. But he broke the beads, she cried. He ruined everything. My power is gone. Gone. By dawn, she was given her normal dress. The people of Bafo stared at her in horror. Now, they understood. Now, they knew why their men had fallen. Now, they saw the curse that had been among them all this time, and their fear turned to anger. The town square was silent. The people of Bafo stood in a circle around Kemi, their faces dark with anger. Their fathers, their brothers, their husbands. Kemi had destroyed them all. She knelt in the dirt, her once beautiful body covered in dust and shame. Her eyes darted around, searching for mercy, but there was none. The people had listened to her confession. They had heard every word. And now there was only one thing left to do. A woman picked up a stone. You ruined my husband, she whispered. She threw the stone. It hit Kemi's arm. A man picked up another. You made my brother mad, he said. He threw his stone. It hit her back. One by one, they picked up stones. One by one, they threw. Kemi screamed. She begged. She wept. But the people did not stop. Stone after stone struck her. Her arms, her legs, her face. She fell to the ground, her body shaking, her voice growing weaker. The pain was too much. The weight of her sins was too heavy. Her cries faded. Her body stilled. And Kemi was no more. The town of Bafo stood over her lifeless form. The waist bead, broken, lay beside her, its power gone forever. Justice had been served. But something was still wrong. Because even as Kemi's body grew cold, the people felt no peace. Something was missing. Something had not returned. And deep inside, they knew this was not the end. Kemi was gone. But the town did not celebrate. There was no joy, no relief, no peace. The men she had destroyed did not get their riches back. Tali, the great trader, still sat in the marketplace with dust on his clothes, begging for food. King Okoli, the mighty king, still wandered the forest, his crown lost forever. Benji, the young banker, still had no wife, no job, no name. The people of Bafo waited. Maybe the gods would restore what was lost. Maybe, now that Kemi was dead, things would go back to how they were before. But days passed, weeks passed, and nothing changed. The curse did not leave with Kemi. The men who had fallen remained fallen. The wealth that had vanished never returned. Only one thing remained, her story. The people of Bafo whispered it to their children. They told it to their daughters as a warning. They told it to their sons as a lesson. And on the nights when the wind blew softly through the trees, some swore they could still hear it. The faint, distant sound of waist beads jingling. And the people of Bafo learned one thing that night. Not everything that glitters is gold. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, please like the video, comment what you learned from the tale, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting tales just like this one. Thank you.